The blood on Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie's badge had long since dried to a rust-brown stain, but the weight of what he'd witnessed in that moonlit clearing outside Copper Falls, Arizona territory, would press against his conscience for the rest of his days. In his 15 years wearing the star, the weathered lawman had seen his share of violence-claimed jumpers shot over disputed mining rights, cattle rustlers strung up by vigilante ranchers, and desperate men who chose bullets over surrender when cornered by the law. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moment when Eleanor Hartwell looked him straight in the eye and confessed to murder with the calm dignity of a woman stating her name for the church registry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The confession itself wasn't what haunted him. It was what came after the choice he made that placed him forever outside the boundaries of the law he'd sworn to uphold, transforming him from enforcer to protector of someone the courts would surely hang if they ever learned the truth about what happened that October night in 1887. Sheriff Mackenzie had been tracking the disturbance reports for 3 days when he first encountered evidence that would lead him to Eleanor Hartwell and the most morally complex decision of his career. Prospectors working claims along Bitter Creek had been reporting strange sounds echoing through the canyon after midnight, not the typical noises of coyotes or mountain cats, but something that resembled human crying mixed with what one grizzled miner described as the sound of someone digging their own grave. The reports might have been dismissed as the whiskey-fueled imaginings of lonely men working isolated claims, except for the physical evidence that began accumulating like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Fresh earthworks appeared overnight in locations where no legitimate mining activity had been authorized. Tools went missing from work sites, only to be discovered days later in remote locations bearing traces of clay that didn't match the local soil composition. Most disturbing of all, several prospectors reported seeing a lone woman moving through the high country during the dangerous hours between sunset and dawn, carrying what appeared to be a heavy burden that required frequent rest stops. Mackenzie's investigation began at the Territorial Claims Office in Copper Falls, where land records painted a picture of a community struggling with the rapid changes that mineral wealth brought to formerly peaceful farming settlements. The silver strike of 1885 had transformed the region from a collection of family homesteads into a boom town that attracted fortune seekers from across the continent, creating tensions between established residents and newcomers who viewed local customs as obstacles to profitable development. Among the established families, few had deeper roots in the community than the Hartwells, who had arrived in 1878 with dreams of building a cattle ranch in the high meadows that provided natural pasture for livestock during summer months. Eleanor's father, Samuel Hartwell, had been among the first settlers to recognize that the region's future lay not in mining but in supplying beef to the growing populations of miners and support workers who flooded into boom towns throughout the territory. The Hartwell Ranch had prospered through careful management and Samuel's reputation for honest dealing in a business environment where trust was often more valuable than gold. Eleanor herself had grown up understanding that the family's success depended on maintaining relationships built on integrity and mutual respect, values that seemed increasingly threatened by the aggressive business practices of newcomers who viewed everything in terms of immediate profit rather than long-term community stability. But prosperity had also brought unwanted attention from men who saw the Hartwell family's success as an opportunity for their own advancement through marriage, alliances that had more to do with property acquisition than genuine affection. Eleanor, at 24, possessed both the intelligence and independence that made her an attractive prospect for men seeking to establish themselves in territorial society, but also the strength of character that made her resistant to relationships based on financial calculation rather than mutual regard. The specific threat that would ultimately lead to violence had emerged 6 months before Mackenzie began his investigation. When Nathaniel Colton arrived in Copper Falls with credentials that established him as a representative of Eastern mining interests seeking to consolidate mineral rights throughout the territory, Colton's approach to business was characterized by methods that skirted the edges of legality while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial activity. His particular interest in the Hartwell property stemmed not from its grazing potential, but from geological surveys that suggested significant silver deposits in the high country that Samuel Hartwell had claimed for summer pasture. Colton's initial offers to purchase the mineral rights had been politely declined, leading to increasingly aggressive tactics designed to pressure the family into selling property that had been their home for nearly a decade. Eleanor's first direct encounter with Colton had occurred during a community gathering at the Copper Falls Church, where territorial families came together for monthly social events that strengthened the bonds holding their frontier community together. Colton's behavior during that initial meeting had been scrupulously correct, displaying the polished manners of someone educated in Eastern cities and accustomed to moving in sophisticated social circles. But Eleanor possessed the intuitive understanding of human nature that came from growing up in an environment where survival often depended on accurate assessment of other people's intentions and capabilities. Something in Colton's manner, the way his eyes lingered on her person, the subtle possessiveness in his voice when he spoke of the Hartwell property, the calculated charm that seemed designed to manipulate rather than genuinely connect, triggered warning instincts that had been honed by years of frontier living. Her attempts to maintain polite distance while avoiding direct confrontation had been frustrated by Colton's persistence and his apparent belief that her resistance was merely a negotiating tactic that could be overcome through the application of sufficient pressure and inducement. His courtship, if it could be called that, took the form of a campaign designed to isolate Eleanor from other potential suitors, while making it clear that marriage to him represented her best opportunity for social advancement and financial security. Escalation had been gradual but relentless. Public displays of attention that made other men reluctant to approach her. Gifts that created obligations she hadn't requested and couldn't politely refuse. Business pressures applied to her father that made family financial stability dependent on maintaining Colton's goodwill. Most insidiously, the spread of rumors that suggested Eleanor had already accepted his attentions, making her appear duplicitous if she encouraged other relationships. Samuel Hartwell's growing concern about Colton's intentions had led to several confrontational conversations in which the rancher attempted to establish clear boundaries around his daughter's autonomy and his family's property rights. But Colton possessed resources and connections that extended far beyond what a single ranching family could counter through direct resistance, including relationships with territorial officials who could make life difficult for anyone who interfered with legitimate business development. The breaking point had come 3 weeks before Mackenzie's investigation began, during a late evening encounter at the Hartwell Ranch, when Colton arrived unannounced with what he described as a final offer for both the mineral rights and Eleanor's hand in marriage. The proposal had been presented as a business transaction in which Eleanor's consent was assumed rather than requested, her value calculated in terms of property consolidation rather than personal compatibility. Eleanor's refusal had been clear and unambiguous, delivered with the dignity of someone who understood her own worth and refused to be treated as a commodity in someone else's business calculations. But Colton's response had revealed the violence that lay beneath his civilized veneer, transforming a rejected suitor into a predator who viewed Eleanor's resistance as a challenge to be overcome through whatever means proved necessary. The assault that followed had been interrupted by Eleanor's quick thinking and her access to the Colt revolver that her father had taught her to use for protection against the various dangers that threatened isolated ranch families. The single shot that ended Nathaniel Colton's life had been fired in defense of something more precious than property, or even physical safety. the fundamental right to make choices about her own life without coercion from men who viewed women as objects to be acquired rather than individuals to be respected. But Eleanor understood, with the clarity that comes from growing up in a society where justice was often more dependent on social connections than factual evidence, that her word against that of a dead man with powerful Eastern backing would likely result in a murder conviction, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the shooting. The territorial legal system, dominated by men who shared Colton's assumptions about women's proper roles in society, would be unlikely to view her actions as justifiable self-defense, rather than the willful murder of a respected businessman. The decision to bury Colton's body in an unmarked grave in the high country had been made with the desperate calculation of someone who understood that legal justice and actual justice might be very different things in a case where the victim possessed more social credibility than the accused. Eleanor had spent 3 sleepless nights digging by moonlight, using tools borrowed from her father's workshop to create a resting place that would keep her secret safe from discovery by casual travelers or prospecting activities. But the physical evidence of her nocturnal activities had been impossible to completely conceal from experienced trackers like Sheriff Mackenzie, whose investigation had been following a trail of disturbed earth and unusual activity patterns that painted an increasingly clear picture of someone working desperately to hide evidence of a significant event. The prospector's reports of crying and digging sounds had been accurate descriptions of Eleanor's struggle to complete a burial that would protect her from legal consequences she couldn't hope to survive. Mackenzie's discovery of the grave site had been the culmination of methodical detective work that combined traditional tracking skills with the logical analysis of evidence patterns that pointed toward a specific location in the high country, where someone had been working to permanently conceal something of considerable size and weight. The freshly turned earth, carefully camouflaged but still visible to eyes trained to read the subtle signs that marked human activity in wilderness settings, had told a story that Mackenzie hoped would prove less tragic than his growing suspicions suggested. The exhumation had revealed Nathaniel Colton's body in a state of preservation that indicated recent burial, along with physical evidence that painted a clear picture of violent death from a gunshot wound to the chest. But it was the care with which the body had been prepared for burial, wrapped in clean cloth, positioned with dignity, accompanied by personal effects that suggested respect rather than hatred, that first challenged Mackenzie's assumptions about the nature of the crime he was investigating. This was not the hasty concealment of evidence by someone who had committed murder in passion or greed. It was the careful work of someone who had taken a life reluctantly and wanted to honor the humanity of the deceased even while protecting themselves from consequences they feared would be unjust. The contradiction between violent death and respectful burial suggested complexities that simple criminal investigation couldn't adequately address. Mackenzie's decision to seek out Eleanor Hartwell for questioning had been based on evidence that pointed clearly toward her involvement, but his approach had been guided by intuition that suggested the situation was far more morally complex than typical frontier violence. The woman he encountered at the Hartwell Ranch bore no resemblance to the desperate criminals he usually pursued, displaying instead the composure of someone who had made difficult choices with full awareness of their consequences. Eleanor's confession, when it finally came, had been delivered with the straightforward honesty of someone who refused to compound one moral compromise with additional deception. She had told Mackenzie exactly what had happened during that final encounter with Colton, holding nothing back about either the circumstances that had led to violence or her decision to conceal the evidence of her actions from legal authorities, who might not understand the impossible situation she had faced. "I killed Nathaniel Colton to protect my honor," she had said, her green eyes steady as mountain granite as she met Mackenzie's gaze without flinching. "He came to my home uninvited, made demands I couldn't accept, and refused to leave when I told him his attentions were unwelcome. When he tried to take by force what I wouldn't give freely, I stopped him with the only means available to me. I buried him with respect because killing him was necessary, not because I took pleasure in his death. The moral clarity of Eleanor's position had struck Mackenzie with the force of revelation, challenging every assumption he had formed about the relationship between law and justice. During his years as a territorial peace officer, here was someone who had committed what the law defined as murder, but who had done so in defense of principles that any decent person would recognize as worth protecting with lethal force if necessary. Mackenzie's response had emerged from depths of character that he hadn't known he possessed, shaped by recognition that sometimes the law served injustice rather than preventing it. "Then I'll protect you from the law," he had promised, making a commitment that would transform him from neutral enforcer of territorial statutes into active participant in a conspiracy to protect someone whose actions he considered morally justified. Regardless of their legal status, the decision had been made in an instant. But its consequences would extend through years of careful deception, strategic misdirection, and the gradual construction of an alternative truth that would protect Eleanor from prosecution while maintaining Mackenzie's ability to continue serving as sheriff in a community that depended on his commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would exploit them. The cover story they developed together transformed Nathaniel Colton's disappearance from mysterious murder into tragic accident, supported by physical evidence that Mackenzie planted with the same methodical care that Eleanor had used to conceal the original crime. Colton's horse, found wandering in terrain known for treacherous footing during weather conditions that could disorient even experienced riders, suggested a simple explanation for his disappearance that required no investigation into his final hours or the circumstances that had brought him to the Hartwell ranch on that fatal evening. But protecting Eleanor's secret would require more than clever storytelling and manufactured evidence. It would demand a fundamental transformation in Mackenzie's understanding of his role as sheriff, from someone who enforced laws written by distant authorities to someone who served justice as he understood it, based on direct knowledge of the people and circumstances that shaped life in his community. The conspiracy that began with Eleanor's confession would eventually encompass all eyes who shared Mackenzie's conviction that legal and moral justice were not always the same thing, creating a network of protection that extended far beyond what any single law officer could provide. But in that moonlit clearing where Eleanor first told him the truth about Nathaniel Colton's death, Mackenzie had acted on instinct and principle rather than calculation, making a choice that would define the rest of his career and challenge every assumption he had ever held about the relationship between law and righteousness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after Eleanor's confession, Sheriff Mackenzie sat in his office watching the territorial sun paint long shadows across the wooden floors of the Copper Falls jail, knowing that every decision he made from this moment forward would either strengthen or destroy the fragile conspiracy he had committed himself to protecting. The badge on his chest felt heavier than the colt on his hip, transformed overnight from a symbol of legal authority into a tool he would now use to subvert the very system it represented. His first challenge came sooner than expected. Judge Harrison Blackwood arrived on the noon stage from Phoenix, responding to telegrams that had been sent by Colton's Eastern associates when their representative failed to maintain his scheduled communications. Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a man who valued efficiency over subtlety, preferring swift resolution of legal matters to lengthy investigations that might interfere with legitimate business operations. "Sheriff Mackenzie," Blackwood announced as he strode into the office with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance with his demands. "I'm here to investigate the disappearance of Nathaniel Colton, a respected businessman whose absence has created considerable concern among investors with significant financial interests in this region. I trust you have made progress in locating him or determining what has become of his person and property. Mackenzie's response required the kind of performance he had never needed to deliver during his years of straightforward law enforcement. Judge Blackwood, I've conducted a thorough investigation of Mr. Colton's activities and movements during his final days in Copper Falls. The evidence suggests he departed the area on October 15th, riding alone into the high country with intentions that remain unclear. His horse was discovered 3 days later, exhibiting signs of distress and injury consistent with a fall in treacherous terrain. The fabrication flowed with surprising ease, built on foundations of half-truth and carefully constructed circumstantial evidence that Mackenzie had spent sleepless hours perfecting. Colton had indeed been in the high country on the date in question, though not under the circumstances Mackenzie was describing. The horse had genuinely been found in a location that suggested accidental mishap, though its condition had been carefully arranged rather than naturally occurring. Judge Blackwood's sharp gray eyes studied Mackenzie with the penetrating gaze of someone trained to detect deception in legal proceedings. That's a remarkably neat explanation for what Colton's associates describe as highly unusual behavior. Mr. Colton was known for his punctuality and reliability in business communications. His failure to maintain contact suggests circumstances more serious than a simple change of travel plans. The interrogation that followed tested every aspect of the cover story Mackenzie had constructed, probing for inconsistencies that might reveal evidence of criminal activity or deliberate concealment. Blackwood's questions were designed to trap anyone attempting to hide information about Colton's fate, creating logical contradictions that would expose deception under sustained examination. But Mackenzie's years of experience in criminal investigation had taught him to think like the people he pursued, understanding the methods used to uncover hidden truths and construct defenses against them. His responses to Blackwood's inquiries were built on verifiable facts whenever possible, supplemented by speculation that sounded reasonable without committing him to details that might later prove problematic. Judge, I've spoken with every resident of Copper Falls who had contact with Mr. Colton during his final week in the community. The picture that emerges is of a man increasingly frustrated by his inability to conclude business arrangements that he had expected to complete quickly and profitably. Several witnesses described his demeanor as agitated and unpredictable, suggesting someone under considerable pressure from his Eastern principles. The character assessment was accurate in every detail, except the specific circumstances that had led to Colton's agitation. His frustration with Eleanor's continued resistance to his advances had indeed affected his behavior in ways that were visible to community members who had observed his interactions during public gatherings and business meetings. Dr. Margaret Shun, who operated the town's medical practice, had mentioned to Mackenzie that Colton had appeared increasingly volatile during his final weeks, displaying symptoms of stress that suggested someone struggling with problems beyond simple business disappointments. Her observations provided legitimate foundation for Mackenzie's portrayal of Colton as someone whose judgment might have been impaired by pressures that could lead to dangerous decisions. Furthermore, Mackenzie continued, the terrain where Mr. Colton's horse was discovered is known to be particularly hazardous during weather conditions that prevailed around the time of his disappearance. We experienced an unexpected early snowfall that would have made navigation difficult even for experienced riders familiar with local conditions. Mr. Colton, despite his many capabilities, was not someone who had extensive experience with high country travel during adverse weather. Judge Blackwood's expression suggested grudging acceptance of explanations that were logical, if not entirely satisfying. Sheriff, while your investigation appears thorough, I remain concerned about the implications of Mr. Colton's disappearance for ongoing business operations throughout this territory. His Eastern associates have invested considerable resources in development projects that depend on resolution of property disputes and mineral rights acquisitions that he was handling. The revelation that Colton's disappearance was disrupting larger business interests created new dimensions of danger. For Eleanor's safety, if Eastern investors concluded that local resistance was responsible for their representative's fate, they might bring resources to bear that would overwhelm any protection Mackenzie could provide through conventional law enforcement methods. But the judge's concerns also revealed potential allies in the territorial business community who might benefit from uncertainty about Colton's aggressive acquisition tactics. Not every investor shared his approach to property development, and some might welcome an opportunity to pursue more collaborative relationships with established community members like the Hartwell family. Mackenzie's strategy for managing these competing interests required careful navigation between different groups, whose goals overlapped in some areas while conflicting dramatically in others. Judge, I understand the concerns of Mr. Colton's associates, but I would suggest that his disappearance might also represent an opportunity for more constructive approaches to territorial development. Several local ranching families have expressed interest in partnerships that could benefit both established residents and incoming investors. The suggestion was designed to redirect attention away from investigation toward future business opportunities that might prove more profitable than the confrontational methods Colton had favored. If Eastern interests could be persuaded that cooperation offered better long-term returns than coercion, the pressure to uncover the truth about Colton's fate might diminish naturally over time. Judge Blackwood's response indicated calculating assessment of political and economic factors that extended beyond simple law enforcement concerns. Sheriff, you may have a point about alternative approaches to development. However, my immediate responsibility is to ensure that Mr. Colton's disappearance doesn't represent criminal activity that could threaten other businessmen operating in this territory. I'll need to interview key community members myself before making final determinations about this matter. The announcement that Blackwood intended to conduct independent interviews created immediate dangers for Eleanor and everyone who had agreed to support Mackenzie's fabricated explanation of Colton's disappearance. Any inconsistency in their accounts could expose the entire conspiracy, leading to investigations that would ultimately uncover the truth about what had happened at the Hartwell Ranch. But the challenge also provided opportunities to strengthen the network of protection around Eleanor by involving additional community members who shared Mackenzie's conviction that she deserved support rather than prosecution. The key was identifying individuals whose own interests aligned with keeping Colton's true fate secret, creating a coalition based on mutual benefit rather than simply moral sympathy. The first such ally emerged unexpectedly during Judge Blackwood's interview with Martha Sinclair, who operated the boarding house where Colton had stayed during his time in Copper Falls. Martha was a widow who had survived frontier hardships through careful observation of human nature and strategic alliances with people who could provide protection and assistance when needed. Your Honor, Martha told Blackwood, with the dignified composure of someone who had learned to manage difficult men through decades of business experience, Mr. Colton was not a pleasant guest during his residency at my establishment. He made inappropriate demands regarding mealtimes, cleaning services, and behavior expectations for my other boarders. Most concerning was his treatment of my hired girl, Rebecca, whom he subjected to unwelcome attention that made her afraid to work in areas of the house where she might encounter him alone. The testimony provided legitimate foundation for portraying Colton as someone whose character problems might have led to conflicts that resulted in his departure from Copper Falls. Under unpleasant circumstances, Martha's account was truthful in every detail while supporting the narrative that Mackenzie needed to maintain Eleanor's safety. But Martha's most valuable contribution came in the form of information she shared privately with Mackenzie after Blackwood's departure. Sheriff, there are things about Mr. Colton's activities that Judge Blackwood doesn't need to know, but which you should understand for the protection of decent folks in this community. That man was conducting business that went well beyond legitimate mining investments. The revelations that followed painted a picture of criminal enterprise that extended throughout the territorial business community, involving schemes that would have resulted in federal prosecution if they had been exposed to proper authorities. Colton's disappearance might actually benefit law enforcement by removing someone whose continued activities could have drawn unwanted federal attention to Copper Falls. He was running confidence games on Eastern investors, Martha explained, selling shares in mining claims that didn't exist or belonged to other people. The money he was spending on property acquisitions came from fraud that would have collapsed eventually, probably taking several legitimate businesses down with it. His disappearance might be the best thing that could happen for honest folks trying to make a living in this territory. The intelligence transformed Mackenzie's understanding of the forces surrounding Eleanor's situation. Instead of protecting her from justice, he might actually be protecting the community from the consequences of federal investigation into Colton's criminal activities. Eleanor's actions had eliminated someone whose continued presence would have threatened the stability and reputation of everyone involved in territorial business development, but the information also revealed how dangerous it would be for the truth about Colton's death to become public knowledge. Federal authorities investigating his financial crimes would conduct the kind of thorough examination that could uncover evidence of his actual fate, leading to prosecutions that would destroy everyone who had participated in concealing the circumstances of his death. The solution required expanding the conspiracy beyond simple protection of Eleanor to encompass active management of information that could threaten multiple community members. Mackenzie found himself coordinating a network of individuals who shared interests in ensuring that certain aspects of Colton's activities never became subject to official investigation. Dr. Chun's medical expertise proved invaluable in providing scientific foundation for the accidental death theory that formed the centerpiece of their coordinated deception. Her examination of Colton's horse revealed injuries that were consistent with the kind of fall that could occur in treacherous terrain, while her analysis of weather conditions during the relevant time period supported claims about navigation hazards that could affect even experienced riders. Sheriff, Dr. Chen explained during a private consultation, the physical evidence supports your assessment of Mr. Colton's probable fate. However, I should mention that his behavior during his final week suggested someone under considerable psychological stress. He visited my office twice complaining of symptoms that indicated anxiety and sleep deprivation, possibly related to business pressures that were affecting his judgment and decision-making capabilities. The medical testimony provided additional credibility for explanations of Colton's disappearance, while revealing information that could justify community concerns about his increasingly erratic behavior. If Colton had been suffering from psychological problems that affected his reliability and judgment, his Eastern associates might be more willing to accept that his disappearance resulted from poor decisions rather than external threats. But perhaps the most crucial ally in Mackenzie's growing conspiracy proved to be Samuel Hartwell himself, who understood better than anyone the forces that had threatened his daughter and the impossible position she had faced when legal protection proved inadequate for her safety. Samuel's reputation in the community provided moral authority that could influence other residents to support the fabricated explanation of Colton's fate. Sheriff Mackenzie, Samuel said during a carefully arranged private meeting, I want you to know that the Hartwell family appreciates everything you're doing to ensure that justice is served in this matter. There are forms of law that serve righteousness, and there are forms of law that serve only the powerful. What you've chosen to enforce is the kind that protects decent people from those who would exploit them. The endorsement from one of Copper Falls' most respected citizens provided Mackenzie with confidence that his moral judgment was sound, even as it committed him more deeply to a course of action that placed him permanently outside the boundaries of conventional law enforcement. He was no longer simply a sheriff investigating a crime. He had become the leader of a community conspiracy designed to protect one of their own from injustice disguised as legal procedure. The network that emerged around Eleanor's protection would ultimately include more than a dozen community members who understood that her actions had served the greater good by eliminating someone whose continued presence threatened the safety and prosperity of everyone in Copper Falls. Their collective commitment to maintaining the secret would prove stronger than any individual's loyalty to abstract legal principles that failed to account for the moral complexities of frontier justice. 3 weeks after Judge Blackwood's departure from Copper Falls, Sheriff Mackenzie received intelligence that transformed their carefully maintained deception from defensive strategy into desperate survival. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous telegraph operator who understood that some messages carried dangers that extended far beyond their written words. Private investigation firm retained by Colton Associates, arriving Copper Falls Thursday. Stop experienced in criminal matters and missing persons. Stop expect thorough examination of all evidence and testimony. Stop advise cooperation with legitimate business interests. Stop Territorial Governor Watkins. Mackenzie read the message 3 times before its full implications penetrated his consciousness. Colton's Eastern partners had apparently concluded that official territorial investigation was insufficient for their purposes, prompting them to hire professional investigators whose methods would be far more sophisticated than anything Judge Blackwood had employed. These would be men trained in the latest detection techniques, equipped with resources that could uncover evidence that had been carefully concealed from casual examination. The news reached Eleanor through channels that Mackenzie had established for emergency communication, bringing her to his office before noon with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that their survival now depended on decisions made in the next few hours rather than careful long-term planning. "How much do they know?" Eleanor asked without preamble, her green eyes steady despite the magnitude of the threat they now faced. During the weeks since her confession, she had transformed from frightened woman seeking protection into active participant in the conspiracy that surrounded her safety, contributing intelligence and strategic thinking that had proven invaluable in maintaining their deception. Mackenzie spread territorial maps across his desk, marking locations where evidence of their activities might be vulnerable to professional investigation. They know Colton disappeared under circumstances that don't satisfy his business partners. They know the official investigation concluded with explanations that leave too many questions unanswered. Most importantly, they know that significant financial interests are at stake, which means they'll have resources to pursue leads that we hoped would remain buried. The tactical situation they faced was unlike anything in Mackenzie's law enforcement experience. Instead of pursuing criminals who had committed crimes, he found himself protecting innocent people from professional investigators whose skills and resources might be superior to his own. The hunters had become the hunted, forced to anticipate and counter techniques that they had never needed to understand during years of conventional police work. Eleanor's analysis of their vulnerabilities revealed the depth of strategic thinking she had developed during weeks of coordinating community resistance to external investigation. "The grave site is our greatest weakness," she said, tracing potential approach routes on Mackenzie's maps. "Professional investigators will have equipment and techniques for detecting disturbed earth that casual examination might miss. If they focus their search in the right areas, physical evidence could expose everything we've worked to protect." But Eleanor had also been planning for exactly this contingency, developing contingencies that could redirect investigation away from dangerous areas, while providing alternative explanations for any evidence that might be discovered despite their precautions. Her months of nocturnal activity in the high country had created multiple sites that could serve as false leads, drawing professional attention toward locations that contain nothing more incriminating than normal mining or ranching activities. "I've been preparing decoy sites throughout the region," Eleanor explained, indicating locations where her careful work had created the appearance of recent excavation without actually concealing anything that could threaten their conspiracy. Each site contains evidence that could justify the kind of digging that investigators might expect to find, but none of them pose any real danger to our security. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, providing logical explanations for disturbances that professional investigators would inevitably discover while directing their attention away from the actual location, where Colton's remains lay hidden beneath carefully restored natural terrain. But implementing the deception would require precise coordination and perfect execution by everyone involved in protecting Eleanor's secret. Mackenzie's role in the expanded conspiracy required skills that went far beyond traditional law enforcement, demanding that he become an active participant in criminal enterprise while maintaining the appearance of cooperation with legitimate investigation. His position as sheriff provided both advantages and vulnerabilities, offering access to information and resources while creating expectations for professional behavior that could expose him if his loyalties became apparent. The private investigators who arrived on Thursday's afternoon stage proved to be exactly the kind of professional opponents that Mackenzie had feared. James Morrison and William Cruz stepped off the coach with the confident bearing of men accustomed to solving cases that had frustrated local authorities, carrying equipment and credentials that spoke of extensive experience in criminal investigation and missing persons recovery. Morrison, the senior partner, possessed the lean intensity of someone whose success depended on attention to details that others might overlook. His initial examination of Copper Falls revealed systematic approach to investigation that began with careful study of the community's social and economic structures before focusing on specific individuals who might possess relevant information. Cruz specialized in physical evidence and crime scene analysis, bringing scientific methods to bear on problems that frontier lawmen typically approached through intuition and local knowledge. His equipment included photographic apparatus for documenting evidence, measuring tools for precise analysis of physical traces, and chemical testing materials that could reveal information invisible to conventional examination. Sheriff Mackenzie, Morrison announced during their initial meeting, "We appreciate your cooperation in our investigation of Mr. Nathaniel Colton's disappearance. Our clients have provided us with detailed information about his activities and associations during his time in this territory, and we're confident that systematic examination will reveal evidence that previous investigation may have overlooked." The challenge in Mackenzie's response was projecting helpful cooperation, while avoiding commitments that might lead to exposure of information he needed to keep secret. "Gentlemen, I'm at your disposal for any assistance you might require. Mr. Colton's disappearance has been a matter of considerable concern for our community, and we're eager to achieve resolution that will provide closure for all interested parties." Morrison's approach to the investigation proved more methodical and potentially dangerous than anything Judge Blackwood had attempted. Instead of relying primarily on witness testimony, the private investigators began with comprehensive examination of physical evidence, creating detailed documentation of everything that might relate to Colton's activities during his final weeks in Copper Falls. Their scrutiny extended to areas that previous investigation had treated as peripheral, including careful analysis of soil samples from locations where Colton had been observed, photographic documentation of terrain features that might have affected his movements, and chemical testing of materials that could provide information about his final activities. But the investigators' most dangerous capability proved to be their systematic approach to witness interrogation, using techniques designed to detect inconsistencies in testimony that might reveal deliberate deception. Each community member who had provided information to Judge Blackwood was re-interviewed, using methods that probed for details and contradictions that casual questioning might miss. Martha Sinclair faced their first intensive examination, enduring Hours of detailed questioning about Colton's behavior during his residency at her boarding house. The investigator's approach was designed to uncover information that she might have withheld from previous interviews, using psychological pressure and careful analysis of her responses to detect any signs of deliberate concealment. Mrs. Sinclair. Morrison pressed during the interview's most intensive phase. Our examination of Mr. Colton's room revealed evidence of activities that seem inconsistent with simple business correspondence. Can you explain why he would have needed materials for document preparation and copying that went beyond normal commercial requirements? The question revealed that the investigators had discovered evidence of Colton's fraudulent business activities, creating both opportunities and dangers for the conspiracy protecting Eleanor. If they became focused on his financial crimes, they might be distracted from the more dangerous investigation of his actual fate. But their discovery also demonstrated capabilities that could uncover other evidence if their attention turned toward the physical circumstances of his disappearance. Martha's response revealed the psychological strength that had made her a valuable ally in protecting Eleanor's secret. Mr. Morrison, I make it my practice not to inquire too closely into my boarders' business activities, provided they pay their rent on time and don't disturb other residents. Mr. Colton's commercial affairs were his own responsibility, though I did observe that he seemed increasingly agitated about matters that he never chose to discuss with me. The answer was truthful while avoiding any information that could lead toward dangerous areas of investigation. But Martha's performance under pressure demonstrated the kind of disciplined deception that would be required from everyone involved. In protecting Eleanor, if their conspiracy was to survive professional examination, Dr. Chin's interview proved even more challenging, as the investigators possessed medical knowledge that allowed them to question her conclusions about Colton's psychological state and the likelihood that stress might have led to the kind of poor judgment that could result in accidental death in dangerous terrain. Dr. Chun, Cruz inquired with the precision of someone trained in forensic analysis. Your assessment of Mr. Colton's mental state during his final weeks suggests anxiety and sleep deprivation. However, our examination of his personal effects reveals evidence of methodical planning and careful attention to detail that seems inconsistent with impaired judgment. Can you reconcile these apparently contradictory indications? The question demonstrated that the investigators had been studying Colton's belongings with scientific thoroughness, discovering evidence that could challenge the accidental death theory if they pursued their analysis far enough. Dr. Chun's response required careful balance between medical accuracy and protection of information that could threaten Eleanor's safety. Mr. Cruz, psychological stress often manifests in contradictory behaviors that can appear confusing to casual observation. A person experiencing anxiety might become more compulsive about certain activities while exhibiting poor judgment in other areas. Mr. Colton's condition during his final weeks was consistent with someone under considerable pressure who was attempting to maintain professional competence despite internal difficulties. But the investigators' most dangerous discovery came during their examination of the high country where Colton's horse had allegedly thrown him during adverse weather conditions. Cruz's analysis of the terrain revealed evidence that challenged key elements of the accidental death theory, creating contradictions that could expose the entire fabrication if they were pursued to their logical conclusions. Sheriff Mackenzie, Morrison reported after 3 days of field investigation. Our examination of the alleged accident site reveals several inconsistencies that require explanation. The physical evidence suggests that Mr. Colton's horse was injured at a different location than where it was discovered, and the weather conditions during the relevant time period were less severe than your reports indicated. The challenge to Mackenzie's carefully constructed narrative created immediate dangers for everyone involved in the conspiracy. If the investigators could prove that their explanation of Colton's disappearance was fabricated, they would intensify their search for alternative theories that could lead to discovery of his actual fate. Mackenzie's response revealed strategic thinking that had been developed through weeks of anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation, but I would suggest that the complexity of mountain weather and terrain can create situations that appear contradictory to examination conducted weeks after the fact. Mr. Colton's horse could have wandered considerable distances after throwing its rider, and weather patterns in high country can vary dramatically over short periods of time." The explanation was plausible while avoiding specific commitments that could be contradicted by further evidence. But Mackenzie understood that the investigators' discoveries had fundamentally altered the tactical situation, transforming their defensive strategy from passive concealment into active misdirection that would require constant vigilance and perfect coordination to maintain. The private investigators' presence in Copper Falls had created an atmosphere of tension that affected everyone who understood the true circumstances of Colton's disappearance. Community members found themselves walking a careful line between helpful cooperation and dangerous revelation, knowing that any mistake could expose Eleanor to prosecution that would certainly result in her execution. But the external pressure also strengthened the bonds between conspiracy participants, creating solidarity based on shared danger and mutual dependence that went beyond simple moral sympathy for Eleanor's situation. Each person involved understood that their own safety now depended on protecting everyone else's secrets, creating a network of loyalty that was stronger than any individual's fear of legal consequences. Eleanor herself emerged as the most effective coordinator of resistance to professional investigation, using intelligence and strategic thinking that had been honed by months of survival planning to anticipate investigative moves and develop countermeasures that could protect the entire community. Her transformation from frightened victim into tactical leader provided inspiration for everyone who risked their own safety to ensure her protection. The battle between professional investigators and community conspiracy would ultimately be decided by factors that neither side could completely control, including the intervention of forces that operated according to principles far removed from simple law enforcement or criminal investigation. The revelation that would transform their desperate defensive struggle into strategic opportunity came from the most unlikely source imaginable: Rebecca Collins, the 16-year-old hired girl at Martha Sinclair's boarding house, who possessed information that could either destroy or save everyone involved in protecting Eleanor's secret. Rebecca's approach to Sheriff Mackenzie occurred under circumstances that demonstrated both her courage and her understanding of the dangerous forces surrounding Colton's disappearance. She waited until Morrison and Cruz had departed for their evening meal before slipping through the back entrance of the sheriff's office, moving with the careful stealth of someone who understood that being observed could have deadly consequences. "Sheriff," Rebecca whispered with urgent intensity that immediately captured Mackenzie's attention, "there are things about Mr. Colton that those investigators don't know. Things that could change everything about what they're trying to find out. But telling you means putting myself in danger from people who have resources to hurt anyone who interferes with their business." The intelligence that Rebecca shared during the next hour revealed criminal networks that extended far beyond anything Mackenzie had suspected, connecting Colton's activities to organized operations that involved corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Her information had been gathered through careful observation during months of serving meals and cleaning rooms for men who assumed that domestic help was invisible and harmless. "Mr. Colton wasn't working alone in his schemes," Rebecca explained, producing documents that she had carefully copied from materials left unguarded in his room during her cleaning duties. He was part of a network that includes territorial officials, Eastern investors, and local business leaders who were planning to seize control of mineral rights throughout this entire region through fraud, intimidation, and violence when necessary. The documents that Rebecca had risked her safety to obtain painted a picture of conspiracy that dwarfed the local concerns about Eleanor's actions. revealing systematic criminal enterprise that threatened the legal foundations of territorial development. Names, dates, financial transactions, and operational plans demonstrated coordination between corrupt officials and criminal organizations that could result in federal prosecution if the evidence reached appropriate authorities. But the most shocking revelation concerned the true purpose behind Morrison and Cruz's investigation. According to correspondence that Rebecca had discovered, the private investigators were not seeking to uncover the truth about Colton's disappearance for the sake of justice or closure. They were attempting to locate and destroy evidence of his criminal activities that could expose their clients to federal prosecution and financial ruin. "They're not trying to find Mr. Colton," Rebecca said with absolute certainty. "They're trying to find his records and eliminate anyone who might know enough about his business to threaten the people who were working with him. If they discover what really happened to him, they'll probably consider it good fortune that saves them the trouble of arranging his permanent disappearance themselves." The intelligence transformed Mackenzie's understanding of the forces surrounding Eleanor's situation. Instead of protecting her from legitimate investigation, he found himself guarding someone whose actions had inadvertently eliminated a threat to the entire territorial business community. Eleanor's defense of her honor had served justice in ways that extended far beyond her personal situation. But Rebecca's information also revealed new layers of danger that went beyond simple criminal prosecution. If Morrison and Cruz were working to protect criminal networks rather than solve legitimate investigation, they possessed resources and motivations that could make them far more dangerous than conventional law enforcement. They would have no scruples about eliminating witnesses who posed threats to their clients' interests. The strategic implications required fundamental reassessment of their defensive approach. Instead of simply hiding evidence and maintaining deceptive narratives, they now needed to consider offensive actions that could neutralize threats while protecting the community from criminal networks that extended beyond their local situation. Eleanor's response to the new intelligence demonstrated the leadership qualities that had enabled her to survive impossible circumstances and coordinate community resistance to external investigation. "This changes everything," she said with quiet determination. "We're not just protecting ourselves from the law anymore. We're protecting our entire community from criminals who view us as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people deserving legal protection." The transformation of their mission from defensive concealment to active resistance required capabilities that went beyond anything in Mackenzie's law enforcement experience. They needed intelligence networks that could monitor criminal activities, communication systems that could coordinate responses to threats, and tactical capabilities that could neutralize dangers that conventional legal methods couldn't address. The community conspiracy that had developed around Eleanor's protection provided foundations for exactly the kind of organization that their new mission required. The bonds of trust and mutual dependence that had been forged through shared danger could be expanded into operational networks capable of sophisticated resistance to criminal networks. Dr. Chun's medical practice provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering, as her professional responsibilities required her to maintain contact with people throughout the region who possessed information about suspicious activities and unusual events. Her status as the community's primary healthcare provider created relationships that could be leveraged for gathering information without arousing suspicions about ulterior motives. Martha Sinclair's boarding house served as an ideal observation post for monitoring the activities of visitors whose presence might indicate external threats to community security. Her position as proprietor of the region's primary accommodation facility provided natural justification for maintaining detailed records about guests and their activities that could be invaluable for intelligence purposes. Samuel Hartwell's connections throughout the ranching community created access to information networks that extended across vast geographical areas, providing early warning about movements and activities that might threaten local residents. His reputation for integrity and reliability made him an ideal coordinator for gathering intelligence from sources who might be reluctant to share sensitive information with law enforcement officials. The network that emerged from their expanded mission possessed capabilities that surprised even Mackenzie, who had underestimated the community's capacity for organized resistance to external threats. Within days of Rebecca's revelations, they had established surveillance systems that could monitor criminal activities throughout the region while maintaining the appearance of normal business and social operations. Their first target was Morrison and Cruz themselves, whose activities in Copper Falls provided opportunities to gather intelligence about their methods, resources, and the criminal networks they represented. Careful observation revealed operational patterns that suggested extensive experience in eliminating evidence and witnesses who posed threats to their clients' interests. The private investigators' equipment included specialized tools for document destruction, chemical compounds that could eliminate physical evidence, and communication devices that allowed coordination with external resources that could provide support for elimination operations. Their presence in Copper Falls represented far more serious threats than simple investigation of Colton's disappearance. But surveillance also revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by defenders who understood local terrain and possessed community support that external operators couldn't match. Morrison and Cruz were operating in unfamiliar territory, dependent on information from sources who might not be entirely reliable, and isolated from the resources that provided their primary advantages over conventional opposition. Eleanor's analysis of the tactical situation revealed strategic thinking that had been developed through months of survival planning under extreme pressure. They're most vulnerable during their field investigations, she observed, studying patterns of movement that surveillance had revealed. When they're examining evidence in remote locations, they're isolated from communication and support, dependent on equipment that could malfunction or be compromised. The opportunity for decisive action came when Morrison and Cruz announced their intention to conduct comprehensive examination of the high country where Colton's alleged accident had occurred. Their planned investigation would take them into terrain where Eleanor's knowledge of local conditions provided overwhelming advantages over visiting investigators who lacked experience with the specific challenges of mountain travel. But the operation that Eleanor proposed went beyond simple harassment or misdirection. She intended to gather evidence of Morrison and Cruz's real activities while exposing their connection to criminal networks that threatened the entire territorial business community. Success would transform local defensive measures into federal prosecution of organized crime that could protect communities throughout the region. We're going to let them find evidence, Eleanor explained to the assembled conspirators, but not the evidence they're looking for. Instead of Colton's remains, they're going to discover proof of the criminal networks that hired them, evidence that will force federal authorities to investigate the corruption that threatens every honest business operation in this territory. The plan required precise coordination and perfect timing, but it offered possibilities for permanent resolution of threats that defensive measures could never achieve. Instead of simply protecting Eleanor from prosecution, they could eliminate the criminal networks that made such protection necessary while exposing corruption that threatened the legal foundations of territorial development. Mackenzie's role in the operation required him to abandon any remaining pretense of conventional law enforcement, transforming himself into an active participant in operations that would either result in triumph over organized crime or exposure that would destroy everyone involved in the conspiracy. His badge would become a tool for justice that operated outside the boundaries of legal procedure, serving principles that transcended statutory obligations. The preparation for their offensive operation revealed capabilities that the community had developed through weeks of coordinated resistance to external investigation. Communication networks that could coordinate activities across vast geographical areas, supply systems that could support extended operations in remote terrain, and tactical skills that combine frontier survival knowledge with sophisticated planning capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, their expanded mission had created unity of purpose that transcended individual concerns about personal safety or legal consequences. Everyone involved understood that they were fighting for principles that affected the entire community's future, creating motivation that was stronger than fear of criminal prosecution or personal danger. Eleanor's transformation from victim seeking protection into leader coordinating community resistance demonstrated capabilities that no one, including herself, had suspected during her months of isolated struggle for survival. Her strategic thinking, tactical planning, and inspirational leadership provided foundations for operations that could challenge criminal networks, possessing resources that individual resistance could never match. The countdown to confrontation began as Morrison and Cruz prepared for their comprehensive examination of the high country, unaware that their investigation would lead them into carefully prepared positions where community defenders possessed every advantage that local knowledge and unified purpose could provide. The hunters were about to discover that their prey had evolved into predators capable of turning the pursuit into a trap that could destroy the very networks that had sent them to eliminate threats to criminal enterprise. The mountains themselves would serve as allies in the coming confrontation, providing terrain advantages that could neutralize superior equipment and resources, while creating opportunities for decisive action that could transform regional balance of power between legitimate community interests and organized criminal networks that viewed honest residents as obstacles to profitable exploitation. Dawn painted the peaks surrounding Devil's Ridge in shades of copper and gold as Eleanor led her carefully positioned team through terrain that would serve as the stage for the most audacious operation in Copper Falls history. The mountain valleys held an October chill that spoke of winter's approach, but the cold that settled in Eleanor's chest came from anticipation rather than weather. Today would determine whether their community conspiracy could transform from desperate defense into decisive victory over forces that threatened everything they had built together. Morrison and Cruz had departed their hotel before sunrise, loaded with equipment that revealed the true scope of their destructive mission. Hidden observers reported surveying instruments, chemical apparatus for evidence destruction, and communication. Devices that could summon additional resources if their initial efforts proved insufficient for eliminating all traces of Colton's criminal activities. But the private investigators were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that had been weeks in preparation, designed by minds that understood mountain terrain with intimate precision and supported by a community network that possessed resources and motivation that no external force could match. Eleanor's plan would use Morrison and Cruz's own methods against them, turning their sophisticated equipment into evidence of criminal conspiracy while exposing the corruption that had sent them to eliminate threats to organized crime. The primary observation post had been established in a natural rock formation that provided commanding views of the entire valley where Colton's alleged accident had supposedly occurred. Dr. Chun occupied the position with photographic equipment that could document every aspect of Morrison and Cruz's activities, creating permanent records that would serve as evidence in federal prosecutions that could destroy the criminal networks threatening territorial communities. They're following the false trail exactly as we anticipated. Dr. Chun reported through the communication system that Samuel Hartwell had coordinated using ranching signals that could carry information across vast distances without attracting attention from anyone unfamiliar with frontier methods. Morrison is using chemical testing equipment on soil samples from the decoy site, while Cruz is documenting what he believes to be evidence of recent excavation. The decoy site had been one of Eleanor's most ingenious creations, carefully prepared to contain exactly the kind of evidence that would convince professional investigators they had discovered something significant while actually revealing nothing that could threaten the community's real secrets. Buried artifacts included items that would implicate Colton in criminal activities without providing any information about his actual fate or the circumstances that had led to his elimination. But the true masterpiece of Eleanor's strategy involved evidence that would implicate Morrison and Cruz themselves in criminal conspiracy, planted in locations where their own investigation would lead them to discover materials that revealed their connection to organized crime networks. Their search for evidence to destroy would instead uncover proof of their own criminal activities, creating documentation that federal authorities could use to prosecute the entire network of corruption. Mackenzie's position in the operation required him to serve as both observer and potential intervention force if Morrison and Cruz discovered the trap being prepared around them. His law enforcement experience provided tactical knowledge that could predict their likely responses to various situations, while his commitment to protecting Eleanor and the community created motivation that transcended any concern about legal consequences for his actions. Stage 2 is ready for implementation. Mackenzie signaled using the discrete communication methods that had been developed through weeks of coordinated planning. Rebecca has positioned the critical evidence where Morrison and Cruz will discover it during their systematic search of the area. Their own thoroughness will lead them directly to materials that expose their criminal connections. Rebecca's role in the operation demonstrated courage that belied her 16 years, requiring her to move through dangerous terrain while carrying evidence that could either save or destroy everyone involved in the conspiracy. Her intimate knowledge of Colton's activities, gained through months of careful observation, had enabled her to create documentation that would convince federal investigators of systematic criminal enterprise involving territorial officials and Eastern business interests. The evidence that Rebecca had prepared included correspondence between Morrison and Cruz and their criminal clients, financial records documenting payments for elimination services, and operational plans that detailed methods for destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses who posed threats to organized crime networks. The materials had been carefully aged and positioned to appear as if Colton had been gathering intelligence about criminal activities before his disappearance, but the most crucial element of Eleanor's strategy involved timing that would create maximum exposure of Morrison and Cruz's real mission while providing irrefutable proof of their criminal connections. Their discovery of planted evidence needed to occur under circumstances that would force them to reveal their true purposes and methods, creating documentation that could support federal prosecution of organized crime networks. The moment of revelation came when Morrison and Cruz reached the carefully prepared cache that contained evidence of their own criminal activities. Dr. Chun's photographic documentation captured their immediate recognition of materials that could destroy them, followed by frantic attempts to eliminate evidence that federal authorities could use to prosecute organized crime networks throughout the territorial business community. They're destroying evidence, Dr. Chun reported with satisfaction, that reflected weeks of careful planning finally reaching fruition. Morrison is using chemical compounds to eliminate documents, while Cruz is attempting to remove physical evidence that could connect them to criminal networks. Their actions are providing perfect documentation of obstruction of justice and criminal conspiracy. But Morrison and Cruz's response to discovering evidence of their own criminal activities revealed resources and capabilities that even Eleanor's careful planning had not fully anticipated. Instead of simply destroying evidence and departing, they began implementing contingency plans that suggested extensive experience in eliminating witnesses and concealing criminal activities through violence rather than merely hiding evidence. They're preparing elimination protocols, Mackenzie observed with growing alarm as surveillance revealed Morrison and Cruz deploying equipment that was designed for purposes far more sinister than simple investigation or evidence destruction. They're planning to ensure that no one in Copper Falls can testify about their activities or the criminal networks they represent. The realization that Morrison and Cruz intended to eliminate potential witnesses transformed Eleanor's carefully planned operation from evidence gathering into life or death struggle against professional killers whose resources included explosives, weapons, and communication devices that could summon additional resources for conducting systematic elimination of everyone who posed threats to organized crime interests. Eleanor's response demonstrated leadership capabilities that had been forged through months of survival under impossible pressure, transforming tactical disadvantage into strategic opportunity through intimate knowledge of terrain and perfect coordination with community allies who shared absolute commitment to protecting each other from external threats. Initiate Mountain Protocol. Eleanor commanded through communication networks that connected every member of their conspiracy, triggering contingency plans that had been developed for exactly this kind of escalation. They want to eliminate witnesses, but they're about to discover that our mountains protect their own, and visitors who come here with hostile intentions find that the terrain itself becomes their enemy. The Mountain Protocol represented the culmination of Eleanor's understanding of how natural forces could be used as weapons against enemies who lacked intimate knowledge of local conditions and seasonal dangers. October weather in the high country could change from clear skies to deadly storms within minutes, creating hazards that could eliminate threats without leaving evidence of human intervention. But implementing the protocol required precise coordination between human intelligence and natural forces, using knowledge that had been gained through years of survival in terrain where a single mistake could result in death from exposure, avalanche, or falls from heights that offered no possibility of survival. Eleanor's team would become instruments of mountain justice, using the landscape itself to eliminate threats that conventional law enforcement could never address. The weather monitoring that Samuel Hartwell had been conducting through ranching networks revealed atmospheric conditions that were perfect for Eleanor's most audacious gambit. A major storm system was approaching from the northwest, bringing wind, snow, and temperature drops that could create life-threatening conditions for anyone caught in exposed terrain without proper preparation and shelter. Storm arrival in 2 hours, Samuel reported with the precision of someone whose survival had depended on accurate weather prediction for decades of frontier ranching. Wind speeds increasing to dangerous levels, temperature dropping below freezing, visibility reducing to near zero. Anyone caught in the open without shelter and supplies will face survival conditions that test even experienced mountain travelers. Eleanor's strategy would use the approaching storm as a natural weapon, positioning Morrison and Cruz in terrain where the weather would eliminate them without any direct action by community defenders. Their own investigation activities would lead them into exposed positions where the mountain's judgment would be swift and final, leaving no evidence of human intervention in their deaths. But the operation required split-second timing and perfect execution by people who were risking their own lives to protect their community from professional killers. Eleanor herself would serve as the primary bait, drawing Morrison and Cruz deeper into dangerous terrain while her allies positioned themselves to ensure that the investigators could not retreat to safety when the storm reached lethal intensity. Mackenzie's role in the final phase required him to abandon any remaining connection to conventional law enforcement, becoming an active participant in operations that would result in the deaths of 2 men, regardless of their criminal activities or threats to community safety. His badge would become a symbol of justice that operated according to principles that transcended legal procedures, serving righteousness that no court could recognize or protect. Final positions, Eleanor signaled as the storm's leading edge began to affect visibility and temperature in the high country, where Morrison and Cruz continued their systematic search for evidence that could threaten criminal networks. They have 15 minutes to reach shelter before mountain conditions become unsurvivable. Their choice to continue pursuit rather than seeking safety will determine their fate. The mountains would serve as judge and executioner in a trial that operated according to laws older than human civilization, where survival depended on wisdom and respect for natural forces, rather than superior equipment or criminal resources. Morrison and Cruz had entered terrain where their urban experience and organized crime connections offered no advantages over frontier knowledge and community solidarity. Eleanor's final gambit would test everything she had learned about survival, leadership, and the relationship between human intelligence and natural forces that shaped life in territories where conventional civilization provided no protection against dangers that demanded absolute competence and perfect judgment to survive. The storm struck Devil's Ridge with the fury of divine retribution, transforming Eleanor's carefully orchestrated trap into a theater where natural forces would render final judgment on men who had brought violence and corruption to a community that valued honor above profit. Wind howled through granite peaks with voices that seemed to carry the accumulated grief of every victim who had suffered at the hands of organized crime networks that viewed human life as expendable obstacles to financial gain. Morrison and Cruz found themselves caught in terrain that offered no mercy to visitors who had underestimated the mountain's capacity for swift and lethal justice. The sophisticated equipment that had provided advantages in urban environments became liabilities in conditions where survival depended on knowledge that could only be gained through years of intimate relationship with landscapes that demanded absolute respect for natural laws. Eleanor maintained her position in a sheltered outcropping that had been carefully selected for its protection from wind and exposure, while providing perfect observation of the death trap that Morrison and Cruz had entered through their own choices. Her years of survival in harsh mountain conditions had taught her to read weather patterns with the precision of someone whose life depended on accurate assessment of atmospheric dangers. They're refusing to retreat, she reported through communication systems that functioned despite the storm's interference, her voice carrying mixture of admiration and pity for men whose arrogance had sealed their fate. Morrison is attempting to continue evidence destruction while Cruz is trying to establish communication with external resources. They still believe their criminal connections can provide salvation from forces that recognize no human authority. The futility of their efforts became apparent as temperature dropped below levels that could sustain life without proper shelter and equipment specifically designed for extreme mountain survival. Morrison's chemical apparatus froze solid, rendering his evidence destruction capabilities useless, while Cruz's communication devices failed as atmospheric conditions disrupted electronic systems that had not been designed for operations in severe weather. But the private investigators' greatest miscalculation involved their assumption that community defenders would be equally affected by conditions that threatened their survival. Eleanor's team had prepared for the storm with equipment and knowledge that enabled them to function effectively in weather that would kill unprepared visitors within hours of exposure. Dr. Chun's photographic documentation continued despite wind and snow that would have defeated conventional equipment, using specialized apparatus that Samuel Hartwell had acquired through ranching networks that understood the necessity of maintaining operations during harsh weather. Her images captured Morrison and Cruz's final hours with scientific precision that would provide irrefutable evidence of their fate for federal authorities investigating organized crime networks. They're beginning to show symptoms of hypothermia, Dr. Chun reported with clinical objectivity that masked her satisfaction at watching justice being served by forces that no criminal network could corrupt or control. Morrison is exhibiting confusion and impaired motor function while Cruz appears to be experiencing the psychological effects of extreme cold exposure. They have perhaps 30 minutes before their condition becomes irreversible. Mackenzie's position in the operation required him to witness the death of 2 men without intervening to save them, testing his commitment to justice that operated outside legal boundaries while forcing him to accept responsibility for consequences that conventional law enforcement could never acknowledge. His badge had become a symbol of righteousness that transcended procedural limitations, serving principles that demanded terrible choices in service of greater good. The moral complexity of watching Morrison and Cruz die from exposure challenged. Every assumption Mackenzie had formed about the relationship between justice and mercy during his years as a territorial peace officer. These men were criminals whose elimination would protect innocent people throughout the region, but they were also human beings whose deaths would weigh on his conscience regardless of their crimes or the threats they represented. But Eleanor's voice carried absolute conviction that sustained Mackenzie's resolve during moments when humanitarian instincts conflicted with strategic necessity. They came here to kill everyone who might testify about criminal networks that have terrorized frontier communities for years. She reminded him through communication systems that connected all participants in the operation. Their deaths will save dozens of innocent lives while exposing corruption that threatens the legal foundations of territorial development. The storm's intensity reached levels that transformed Devil's Ridge into an environment where human survival became impossible without shelter that Morrison and Cruz could no longer reach due to hypothermia-induced confusion and motor impairment. Their sophisticated training and criminal resources proved useless against natural forces that recognized no distinction between professional killers and innocent travelers who had made fatal miscalculations about mountain dangers. Morrison's final moments revealed the psychological breakdown that extreme cold could inflict on minds unprepared for the reality of death in wilderness settings. His attempts to continue evidence destruction became increasingly erratic and purposeless, driven by training that could not adapt to circumstances where professional competence meant nothing compared to fundamental survival knowledge. Cruz's death came more quickly, his younger body succumbing to hypothermia with less resistance than his experienced partner could muster. His communication equipment continued transmitting distress signals that reached no recipients capable of providing assistance in conditions that grounded aircraft and made ground travel suicidal for anyone without intimate knowledge of local terrain. Eleanor's team maintained their positions throughout Morrison and Cruz's final hours, documenting every aspect of their deaths while ensuring that no evidence of human intervention could be discovered by investigators who would eventually examine the site. The storm provided perfect concealment for activities that would have been impossible to conduct without natural cover that erased all traces of human presence. Storm passing, Samuel Hartwell reported as wind speeds began to decrease in visibility, improved enough to assess the results of Eleanor's most audacious operation. Temperature rising to levels that will allow safe movement within 2 hours. Morrison and Cruz are both deceased, with all evidence suggesting accidental death from exposure during severe weather conditions. The aftermath of the storm revealed a scene that would convince any investigator that Morrison and Cruz had died from natural causes rather than human intervention. Their bodies lay in positions consistent with hypothermia victims who had become confused and disoriented during failed attempts to reach shelter, surrounded by equipment that had malfunctioned due to extreme weather conditions, but hidden among their belongings were the documents that Rebecca had planted, preserved by waterproof containers that would protect evidence of criminal conspiracy from weather damage while ensuring its discovery by federal authorities investigating the private investigators' deaths. The materials would expose organized crime networks throughout the territorial business community, providing information that could result in prosecutions extending to the highest levels of government. Corruption. Dr. Chen's photographic documentation had captured every stage of Morrison and Cruz's deaths with scientific precision that would satisfy federal investigators while concealing any evidence of human intervention in their fate. Her images showed professional killers being defeated by natural forces that they had failed to respect, dying as victims of their own arrogance rather than community resistance. The intelligence that Eleanor's operation had gathered extended far beyond simple elimination of immediate threats to encompass evidence that could transform territorial law enforcement approaches to organized crime. Morrison and Cruz's belongings contained information about criminal networks operating throughout the American West, providing federal authorities with resources for prosecutions that could protect frontier communities from systematic exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, the operation had demonstrated community capabilities that could serve as models for resistance to organized crime in regions where conventional law enforcement proved inadequate for protecting honest residents from criminal networks possessing superior resources and political connections. Eleanor's leadership had created methods that other communities could adapt for defending themselves against similar threats. Mackenzie's role in documenting the scene required careful balance between honest law enforcement reporting and protection of information that could expose community involvement in Morrison and Cruz's deaths. His official investigation would conclude that the private investigators had died from accidental exposure during severe weather, supported by physical evidence that made alternative explanations unnecessary. The federal investigation that followed Morrison and Cruz's deaths would focus on evidence of criminal conspiracy rather than circumstances surrounding their fate, leading to prosecutions that dismantled organized crime networks throughout the territorial business community. Eleanor's strategy had transformed local defensive measures into federal offensive operations against corruption that threatened frontier development. The broader implications of their success extended beyond immediate protection of Copper Falls to encompass demonstration that organized crime could be defeated by communities possessing sufficient unity, intelligence, and determination to resist criminal networks that viewed honest residents as obstacles to profitable exploitation. Eleanor's methods would influence frontier justice approaches for generations, but the personal cost of victory weighed heavily on everyone who had participated in operations that resulted in human deaths, regardless of their necessity for community protection. Eleanor herself struggled with psychological burdens that came from orchestrating the deaths of two men, even though their elimination had been essential for protecting innocent lives throughout the region. The moral complexity of frontier justice required acceptance that survival sometimes demanded choices that civilized legal systems could not recognize or support, creating responsibilities that extended beyond individual conscience to encompass community welfare and protection of principles that transcended statutory limitations on righteous action. Eleanor's transformation from victim seeking protection into leader coordinating community resistance had been completed through operations that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected during her months of desperate struggle for survival. Her evolution represented possibilities that frontier conditions could create when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances, requiring extraordinary responses. The community conspiracy that had begun with simple desire to protect Eleanor from unjust prosecution had evolved into sophisticated organization, capable of defeating professional criminal networks through methods that combined frontier knowledge with strategic planning that could challenge any external threat to community security and prosperity. The legacy of Eleanor's leadership would extend through decades of territorial development that prioritized community welfare over individual profit, creating models for sustainable growth that enhanced rather than exploited the natural and human resources that sustained frontier civilization in the American West. 6 weeks after the storm claimed Morrison and Cruz at Devil's Ridge, Federal Marshal Robert Harrison arrived in Copper Falls, carrying credentials that commanded respect throughout the territorial justice system and authority that extended far beyond anything local law enforcement could provide. His investigation would either validate Eleanor's carefully constructed deception or expose the community conspiracy that had protected her through months of desperate maneuvering against forces that threatened everything they had built together. Marshal Harrison's reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, known throughout the American West as someone who possessed both the intellectual rigor necessary for complex criminal investigation and the moral courage required to pursue justice regardless of political pressures or economic interests that might prefer certain truths to remain buried beneath layers of official indifference. His arrival in Copper Falls created tensions that went beyond simple concern about federal scrutiny to encompass recognition that their community's future would be determined by decisions made by someone whose loyalty belonged to principles rather than local interests or personal relationships that had sustained their conspiracy through its most dangerous phases. Eleanor's first encounter with Marshall Harrison occurred under circumstances that tested every aspect of the persona she had developed during months of coordinating community resistance to external investigation. The federal officer's penetrating gray eyes seemed to assess not just her words, but the character beneath them, searching for evidence of deception or criminal involvement that could justify prosecution under federal statutes. Miss Hartwell, Marshall Harrison began with the measured precision of someone accustomed to questioning witnesses whose testimony could determine life or death outcomes in federal court. I'm investigating circumstances surrounding the deaths of Morrison and Cruz, private investigators whose work appears to have uncovered evidence of significant criminal activity involving territorial officials and Eastern business interests. The interview that followed represented the ultimate test of Eleanor's ability to maintain deceptive narratives while appearing completely honest and cooperative with legitimate federal investigation. Her responses required careful balance between providing useful information about Morrison and Cruz's discoveries while avoiding any details that could expose her role in their deaths or the community conspiracy that had protected her from prosecution. Marshall Harrison, Eleanor replied with composure that reflected months of preparation for exactly this moment. I had minimal contact with those gentlemen during their time in Copper Falls. They seemed primarily interested in business matters that didn't concern our ranching operations, though I did observe that they appeared increasingly agitated about something they had discovered during their investigation. The federal marshal's questions revealed sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation techniques that went far beyond anything Eleanor had faced during previous interrogations. His inquiries were designed to detect not just factual inaccuracies, but psychological inconsistencies that might indicate deliberate concealment of information relevant to federal prosecution of organized crime networks. But Eleanor's months of survival under extreme pressure had taught her to maintain psychological equilibrium during situations that would break most people's ability to think clearly and respond appropriately to complex challenges, requiring split-second decision-making and perfect execution of predetermined strategies. Marshall Harrison's examination of physical evidence at Devil's Ridge revealed investigative capabilities that challenged every aspect of the cover story that community conspirators had constructed to explain Morrison and Cruz's deaths. His analysis included forensic techniques that could detect human intervention in what appeared to be natural disasters, using scientific methods that frontier law enforcement had never encountered. The evidence suggests that Morrison and Cruz died from exposure during severe weather conditions, Marshall Harrison reported to Sheriff McKenzie during their professional consultation. But certain aspects of the scene require explanation that goes beyond simple accidental death during adverse conditions. The federal marshal's observations included details about equipment positioning, body placement, and environmental factors that could indicate human involvement in creating circumstances that led to the private investigator's deaths. His scientific approach to evidence analysis posed threats that Eleanor's community allies had not anticipated during their planning phases. But Marshall Harrison's investigation also revealed evidence that validated the most important aspects of Eleanor's strategy for exposing criminal networks that had threatened frontier communities throughout the territorial business system. Morrison and Cruz's belongings contained documentation that painted comprehensive pictures of organized crime involving corruption at every level of government and business operations. The materials discovered at the scene indicate systematic criminal enterprise that extends far beyond anything we suspected, Marshall Harrison explained to assembled community leaders during a meeting that would determine federal response to evidence of widespread corruption. Morrison and Cruz appear to have been gathering intelligence about criminal networks for purposes that remain unclear, but their documentation provides foundation for prosecutions that could transform territorial law enforcement approaches to organized crime. The federal investigation that emerged from Morrison and Cruz's evidence focused attention on criminal networks rather than circumstances surrounding their deaths, leading to arrests and prosecutions that dismantled organized crime operations throughout the American West. Eleanor's strategy had successfully redirected federal resources toward targets that deserved prosecution while protecting community members who had acted in defense of legitimate interests, but the broader implications of federal investigation created opportunities that extended far beyond simple protection from criminal prosecution to encompass transformation of territorial development approaches that could serve as models for sustainable growth throughout frontier regions. Eleanor's leadership during the crisis had demonstrated capabilities that qualified her for roles in territorial administration that could influence policy development for decades. Marshall Harrison's recommendation that Eleanor be appointed to the newly created position of Territorial Liaison for Community Development, REFLECTED, federal recognition of her unique qualifications for coordinating relationships between government authorities and frontier residents, whose cooperation was essential for effective law enforcement and economic development that served legitimate interests rather than criminal exploitation. Miss Hartwell, Marshall Harrison explained during their final official interview, your community's response to the threats posed by organized crime networks demonstrates capabilities that federal authorities need to understand and support throughout territorial development. Your appointment would provide opportunities to apply lessons learned in Copper Falls to other communities facing similar challenges from criminal networks. The federal position offered Eleanor opportunities to influence territorial policy while maintaining protection from any future investigation of Nathaniel Colton's disappearance, creating official status that would make prosecution politically impossible regardless of what evidence might eventually be discovered about circumstances surrounding his death. But Eleanor's decision about accepting federal appointment required careful consideration of responsibilities that would extend far beyond personal safety, to encompass obligations for protecting other communities from criminal networks that viewed frontier residents as obstacles to profitable exploitation, rather than citizens deserving legal protection and economic opportunity. Her acceptance of the federal position represented evolution from local community defender into regional advocate for policies that prioritize sustainable development over extractive exploitation, creating influence that could affect territorial approaches to resource management, community protection, and law enforcement coordination between federal authorities and local residents. The transformation of Eleanor's role from fugitive hiding from unjust prosecution into federal official responsible for coordinating community development policy demonstrated possibilities that frontier conditions could create when extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses from ordinary people facing impossible choices between survival and principles. Sheriff Mackenzie's relationship with Eleanor during her transition to federal service provided opportunities for him to influence territorial law enforcement policy while maintaining his commitment to justice that served community welfare rather than abstract legal procedures that failed to account for moral complexities of frontier survival and community protection. His unofficial advisory role in Eleanor's federal operations allowed him to apply lessons learned during their conspiracy to broader questions about the relationship between legal authority and moral responsibility in regions where conventional law enforcement proved inadequate for protecting honest residents from criminal networks possessing superior resources and political connections. The network of community allies that had protected Eleanor during her months of desperate struggle transformed into informal advisory council that could influence federal policy development through their combined knowledge of frontier conditions. and practical experience with community organization that could resist external threats while maintaining internal cohesion and mutual support. Dr. Chun's medical expertise contributed to federal health policy development that recognized unique challenges of frontier communities, while Martha Sinclair's business experience influenced economic development approaches that prioritized local prosperity over external exploitation of natural and human resources. Samuel Hartwell's ranching knowledge shaped federal approaches to land management that balanced resource conservation with community development needs, while Rebecca Collins' intelligence-gathering capabilities contributed to federal investigation. Methods that could expose criminal networks operating throughout territorial business systems. The legacy of their conspiracy extended beyond protection of Eleanor to encompass demonstration that organized crime could be defeated by communities possessing sufficient unity, intelligence, and determination to resist criminal networks that viewed honest residents as expendable obstacles to financial gain. Eleanor's federal service would influence territorial development policy for decades, creating frameworks for sustainable growth that enhanced rather than exploited the natural and human resources that sustained frontier civilization throughout the American West. Her transformation from victim seeking protection into leader coordinating regional development represented possibilities that frontier conditions could create when survival demanded evolution beyond conventional limitations. The moral complexity of frontier justice that had shaped Eleanor's original crisis continued to influence her federal service, requiring acceptance that effective governance sometimes demanded choices that legal systems could not recognize or support, creating responsibilities that extended beyond individual conscience to encompass community, welfare, and protection of principles that transcended statutory limitations. Her evolution from desperate fugitive into federal administrator demonstrated that honor defended through necessary violence could be transformed into authority that served justice through institutional change rather than individual action, creating legacies that extended far beyond personal survival to encompass protection and empowerment of entire communities facing similar challenges from organized criminal exploitation. 2 years into Eleanor's tenure as territorial liaison for community development, the ghosts of Nathaniel Colton's buried crimes would return to test everything she had built from the ashes of her original crisis. The revelation came through channels that demonstrated how far-reaching the criminal networks had been, and how dangerous the survivors of those networks remained when their interests were threatened by federal policies that prioritized community welfare over extractive exploitation. The challenge emerged from an unexpected quarter when Margaret Blackwood, Judge Harrison Blackwood's daughter and a prominent Eastern socialite with connections to investment circles that had lost fortunes due to federal prosecutions resulting from Morrison and Cruz's evidence, arrived in the territorial capital carrying credentials that demanded attention from the highest levels of government administration. Margaret possessed the sophisticated intelligence and ruthless determination that had made her father effective in protecting criminal interests, but she also carried personal motivations that went beyond simple financial recovery to encompass revenge against those responsible for destroying the networks that had provided her family's wealth and social position. Her investigation into the federal prosecutions that had dismantled organized crime operations throughout the territorial business community had led her to question the convenient deaths of Morrison and Cruz, whose evidence had been too perfectly preserved and too comprehensively damaging to result from accidental discovery during legitimate investigation activities. "Miss Hartwell," Margaret announced during their first confrontational meeting at the Territorial Administration Building, "my research into recent federal prosecutions has revealed patterns that suggest systematic manipulation of evidence and possible elimination of witnesses who posed threats to certain community interests. I'm here to ensure that justice is served for crimes that may have been concealed beneath layers of federal authority and territorial politics." The accusation struck at the heart of Eleanor's carefully constructed new identity, threatening not only her personal safety, but the entire network of policies and relationships that had emerged from her transformation into federal administrator. Margaret's investigation possessed resources and political connections that could override federal protection if her suspicions proved accurate, enough to justify intensive examination. Eleanor's response required all the psychological strength she had developed during years of survival under extreme pressure, maintaining official composure while assessing threats that could destroy everything she had accomplished through her federal service. Miss Blackwood, I'm naturally concerned about any allegations of criminal activity within territorial administration. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, I encourage you to present it through appropriate federal channels for proper investigation. But Margaret's approach revealed strategic thinking that had been carefully planned to exploit vulnerabilities in Eleanor's position that direct federal investigation could not address. Instead of making formal accusations that would trigger official procedures, she began a systematic campaign of social and political pressure designed to isolate Eleanor from all eyes while building support for unofficial investigation that could operate outside federal oversight. Her methods included cultivation of relationships with Eastern investors who had been affected by federal prosecutions, territorial officials who resented federal interference in local business operations, and community members who might be persuaded that Eleanor's rapid rise to federal authority suggested hidden criminal activities rather than legitimate recognition of exceptional capabilities. The campaign that Margaret orchestrated represented sophisticated application of social warfare techniques that could destroy reputations and political careers without ever requiring proof of actual criminal activity. Her goal was to create sufficient suspicion about Eleanor's background to justify investigation that could uncover evidence of the conspiracy that had protected her from prosecution for Colton's death. Eleanor's counter-strategy required coordination with allies who had shared the original conspiracy while maintaining absolute secrecy about their continued cooperation in protecting information that could still result in federal prosecution. Despite the passage of time and Eleanor's current official status, Sheriff Mackenzie's role in the developing crisis proved crucial for gathering intelligence about Margaret's activities while providing security for Eleanor that could not be officially acknowledged through federal channels. His position in local law enforcement provided access to information networks that could monitor threats while maintaining plausible deniability about any coordination with federal officials. She's conducting systematic interviews with anyone who had contact with Morrison and Cruz, Mackenzie reported during carefully arranged, private meetings that maintained appearance of routine consultation between federal and local authorities. Her question suggests she's looking for inconsistencies in witness testimony that could indicate coordinated deception about circumstances surrounding their deaths. Dr. Chen's medical practice provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering about Margaret's investigation, while offering opportunities to influence community response to inquiries that could threaten the network of relationships that had sustained Eleanor's protection throughout her transformation from fugitive into federal administrator. Margaret Blackwood is asking very specific questions about Morrison and Cruz's equipment and physical condition when their bodies were discovered. Dr. Chun reported with clinical precision that masked her concern about potential exposure of their conspiracy. Her knowledge of forensic analysis suggests professional training that goes beyond simple legal education or business investigation. But the most serious threat to Eleanor's security came from Margaret's discovery of financial irregularities in territorial business records that could provide evidence of systematic coordination between community leaders that served purposes beyond legitimate economic development or law enforcement cooperation. The payments that Samuel Hartwell had made to various community members for services related to Eleanor's protection had been carefully disguised as routine business transactions, but Margaret's examination revealed patterns that suggested organized activity with purposes that official records did not adequately explain. She's identified financial connections between everyone who was involved in protecting you. Samuel warned during emergency consultations that brought together the core conspiracy members for the first time since Eleanor's appointment to federal service. The money trails could provide evidence of criminal conspiracy that would expose our entire network if federal authorities decide to investigate our activities. Eleanor's response to the escalating threats demonstrated leadership, capabilities that had been refined through years of federal service, applying strategic thinking that operated on regional and national levels while maintaining absolute commitment to protecting the community allies who had risked everything to ensure her survival and transformation. Margaret Blackwood's investigation threatens not just our safety but the entire framework of federal policy that has emerged from our experience, Eleanor explained to her assembled allies. If she succeeds in exposing our conspiracy, the resulting scandal could undermine territorial development approaches that have protected dozens of communities from criminal exploitation. We're fighting for principles that extend far beyond personal survival. The strategy that Eleanor developed for countering Margaret's investigation required capabilities that went beyond simple defensive concealment to encompass active manipulation of federal resources that could neutralize threats while maintaining appearance of routine administrative activities, serving legitimate government interests. Her plan involved coordination with federal authorities, who had benefited from the territorial development policies that Eleanor's experience had influenced, creating institutional support for protecting her from investigation that could threaten programs that had proven effective for community development throughout the American West. Marshal Harrison's continued involvement in territorial law enforcement provided crucial support for Eleanor's position, his federal authority serving as protection against investigation that could expose activities that had ultimately served federal interests despite their technically criminal nature. Miss Hartwell, Marshal Harrison confirmed during official consultations that provided cover for coordination of defensive measures. Federal authorities recognize the value of territorial development policies that have emerged from your community development work. Any investigation that threatens to undermine those programs would be contrary to federal interests in maintaining stability and prosperity throughout frontier regions. But Eleanor's most effective weapon against Margaret's investigation proved to be the network of communities throughout the territory that had benefited from federal policies influenced by her experience, creating political support that could override individual accusations, regardless of their accuracy or legal justification. Representatives from dozens of frontier towns that had successfully resisted criminal exploitation through methods derived from Eleanor's approach provided testimonials that demonstrated the practical value of her federal service while creating political pressure that made investigation of her background contrary to territorial development interests. The coalition that emerged to support Eleanor's position included ranchers, miners, merchants, and territorial officials who had witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of community development approaches that prioritized local welfare over external exploitation, creating constituencies that could influence federal policy. Regardless of academic concerns about legal procedures or historical accuracy, Margaret's investigation ultimately foundered on political realities that transcended her personal motivations or family interests. Encountering resistance from federal authorities who recognized that Eleanor's continued service was more valuable than any historical justice that might be served by exposing crimes that had ultimately benefited legitimate territorial development. The confrontation between Eleanor and Margaret reached its climax during public hearings that tested Eleanor's ability to maintain her carefully constructed identity while defending policies that had emerged from her unique experience with community, organization, and federal administration. Miss Blackwood, Eleanor stated with authority that reflected years of federal service and regional policy development, your investigation appears to be motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate Concerns about territorial administration. Federal policies that have emerged from community development work have demonstrably improved conditions throughout frontier regions, and any attempt to undermine those programs based on unsubstantiated allegations would be contrary to territorial interests. The public support that Eleanor commanded during the hearings demonstrated how completely she had transformed from desperate fugitive into respected federal administrator, whose influence extended throughout territorial policy development and community protection programs that served legitimate interests rather than criminal exploitation. 5 years after Margaret Blackwood's failed investigation, Eleanor Hartwell stood before the newly constructed territorial courthouse in Phoenix, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the dedication ceremony for what would become the cornerstone of a transformed approach to frontier justice. The building behind her represented more than architectural achievement. It symbolized the institutionalization of principles that had emerged from her personal crisis into systematic protection for communities throughout the American West. The courthouse bore inscriptions that honored victims of criminal exploitation while celebrating communities that had successfully resisted organized crime through unity, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to protecting their own members. Among those honored names, Nathaniel Colton appeared as a victim of criminal networks, his true nature buried beneath layers of official narrative that served justice more effectively than historical accuracy ever could. Eleanor's address to the assembled territorial officials, federal representatives, and community leaders would mark her final public appearance as territorial liaison for community development before accepting appointment as the first director of the newly established Federal Bureau of Community Protection, a position that would extend her influence to frontier regions throughout the expanding American nation. Honored guests, Eleanor began with the authority that had been earned through years of transforming personal survival into institutional change. We gather today to celebrate more than the completion of a building. We commemorate the transformation of American frontier justice from a system that served the powerful into one that protects the principles upon which our democratic society must be founded. The morning sun cast long shadows across the assembled crowd as Eleanor continued her address, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth to power through years of navigating the complex relationships between individual conscience and institutional authority. Her green eyes, weathered by years of responsibility but undimmed by compromise, swept across faces that represented every level of American territorial society. When I first came to serve in territorial administration, Eleanor continued, I brought with me experience that some might consider unconventional for federal service. I had witnessed firsthand how organized criminal networks could exploit gaps in legal protection, leaving honest communities vulnerable to predators who viewed frontier residents as obstacles to profitable extraction rather than citizens deserving equal protection under American law. Her speech outlined the evolution of territorial policy that had emerged from the crisis in Copper Falls, demonstrating how community resistance to criminal exploitation had been systematized into federal programs that provided resources and support for frontier residents facing similar threats from organized crime networks operating beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The statistics that Eleanor presented painted a comprehensive picture of success that validated every risk taken during those desperate months when survival had required choices that legal systems could not recognize or support. Communities throughout the territory had successfully resisted criminal exploitation. Territorial development had proceeded according to sustainable principles that enhanced rather than destroyed natural and human resources, and federal prosecution of organized crime had eliminated networks that had terrorized honest residents for decades. The community protection protocols that we have implemented throughout this territory have prevented 17 documented attempts by criminal networks to establish extractive operations that would have displaced local residents and destroyed natural resources. Eleanor reported to the assembled officials. These protocols have preserved over 200,000 acres of productive land for sustainable development, while maintaining community autonomy and democratic participation in decisions affecting local welfare. But Eleanor's most significant achievement lay not in policy development or institutional change, but in the transformation of American attitudes toward the relationship between individual conscience and legal authority in situations where CONVENTIONAL justice systems failed to protect innocent people from criminal exploitation. The precedents established through her federal service had influenced Supreme Court decisions that recognized community self-defense as a legitimate response to systematic criminal activity that overwhelmed local law enforcement capabilities. Her work had contributed to constitutional interpretation that balanced federal authority with community autonomy in ways that protected democratic principles while enabling effective resistance to organized crime. The legal frameworks we have established here in Arizona territory are now being adopted in Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada, Eleanor announced to applause from territorial representatives who understood the national implications of their pioneering work. Federal authorities have recognized that effective governance in frontier regions requires approaches that honor both constitutional law and community wisdom gained through direct experience with challenges that urban legal systems never encounter. Sheriff Mackenzie, now serving as Territorial Marshal for Community Law Enforcement, represented the institutionalization of the partnership that had sustained Eleanor's transformation from fugitive into federal administrator. His appointment to territorial authority demonstrated recognition that effective law enforcement required understanding of both legal procedure and community dynamics that conventional training could not provide. Eleanor Hartwell has demonstrated that honor defended through necessary action can be transformed into authority that serves justice through institutional change, Mackenzie declared during his portion of the dedication ceremony. Her leadership has created frameworks for protecting communities that will influence American law enforcement for generations to come. The Marshal's weathered face carried scars from years of frontier law enforcement, but his eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had learned that true justice sometimes required courage to act outside conventional procedures when moral principles demanded extraordinary measures to protect innocent people from criminal exploitation. Dr. Margaret Chun's appointment as Territorial Health Commissioner reflected similar recognition that frontier conditions required officials who understood community needs through direct experience rather than academic theory. Her medical expertise had been expanded into public health policy that addressed unique challenges of frontier life while maintaining standards that protected vulnerable populations from exploitation. The community health networks that Dr. Chun has established provide medical care to over 50,000 frontier residents who previously had no access to professional health care, Eleanor noted in her address. These networks also serve as intelligence systems that can identify threats to community welfare before they become crises requiring emergency intervention. Martha Sinclair's establishment of the Territorial Women's Business Association provided economic opportunities for frontier women while creating networks that could resist criminal exploitation through mutual support and coordinated resistance. Her boarding house had become a training center where women learned skills necessary for economic independence and community leadership. Mrs. Sinclair's programs have enabled 347 frontier women to establish independent businesses that contribute over $180,000 annually to territorial economic development. Eleanor reported with pride that reflected her understanding of how individual empowerment strengthened entire communities. These businesses provide alternatives to exploitative employment while creating economic foundations that support community autonomy. Samuel Hartwell's ranching operations had evolved into demonstration projects that showed how sustainable land management could provide economic prosperity while maintaining environmental integrity. His techniques were being adopted throughout territorial ranching communities, creating economic models that prioritized long-term community welfare over short-term individual profit. Mr. Hartwell's Sustainable Ranching Initiative has increased livestock productivity by 23% while improving soil quality and water conservation throughout participating operations, Eleanor announced to approving murmurs from ranching representatives in the audience. These methods prove that environmental protection and economic prosperity are complementary rather than competing interests when development serves community needs. Rebecca Collins, now married and operating her own business as a territorial communications coordinator, represented the opportunities that Eleanor's transformation had created for younger generations of frontier residents. Her intelligence-gathering skills had been developed into legitimate career providing communication services for federal agencies operating throughout territorial regions. Miss Collins, now Mrs. Patterson, coordinates communication networks that connect 47 frontier communities with federal resources while maintaining local autonomy in decision-making processes, Eleanor explained. Her work demonstrates how skills developed through community defense can be transformed into professional capabilities that serve legitimate governmental functions. But the most profound validation of Eleanor's choices came through relationships that had emerged from the network of protection that had sustained her survival and transformation. The marriages, partnerships, and community alliances that connected every member of their original conspiracy demonstrated that trust forged under extreme pressure could serve as foundation for lasting institutions that strengthened frontier society. The children being raised within their extended community network would inherit understanding of both individual responsibility and community solidarity that could serve American democratic institutions as frontier conditions evolved into settled civilization throughout the expanding nation. Young voices could be heard in the crowd as families gathered for the courthouse dedication, representing the next generation of Americans who would benefit from the institutional frameworks that Eleanor's crisis had ultimately created. These children would grow up understanding that democratic governance required active participation and moral courage, not passive acceptance of authority that failed to serve community welfare. Eleanor's personal relationships had also evolved in ways that honored both her past struggles and her current responsibilities. Her marriage to federal Judge William Morrison, the territorial official who had replaced Judge Blackwood after his involvement in criminal networks, had been exposed, represented partnership between equals who shared commitment to justice that transcended legal procedure when moral principles demanded extraordinary action. Their wedding ceremony, conducted by Marshal Harrison in the courthouse where Eleanor had first testified about organized crime networks, symbolized the institutionalization of values that had emerged from personal crisis into systematic protection for American democratic principles. Judge Morrison and I share understanding that legal authority must serve moral principles rather than abstract procedures, Eleanor had said during their wedding announcement. Our partnership represents commitment to ensuring that American justice protects those who cannot protect themselves while maintaining constitutional frameworks that preserve democratic governance. But Eleanor's greatest personal achievement lay in her relationship with her daughter, Sarah Morrison, whose upbringing reflected synthesis of individual strength and community responsibility that could serve as a model for future generations of American women. Sarah's education included both academic subjects and practical skills for frontier survival, ensuring she could adapt to whatever challenges American expansion might create. 8-year-old Sarah sat in the front row of the courthouse dedication ceremony, her bright eyes reflecting intelligence that had been nurtured through exposure to both formal education and practical experience with community leadership. Her presence represented Eleanor's hope that future generations would inherit a more just society where individual conscience and institutional authority could work together to protect democratic principles. The question that had haunted Eleanor threw out. Her transformation, whether on or defended through violence, could be justified by its consequences, had been answered through results that extended far beyond personal survival, to encompass protection and empowerment of entire communities facing similar challenges from criminal exploitation. There are those who would argue that justice requires adherence to legal procedure, regardless of moral consequences. Eleanor addressed this question directly in her speech. I have learned through experience that true justice sometimes demands courage to act according to conscience when institutional systems fail to protect innocent people from criminal exploitation. The results of such action must be measured not by compliance with abstract rules, but by outcomes that serve democratic principles and community welfare. Nathaniel Colton's grave remained unmarked and unvisited in the high country above Copper Falls, but his death had prevented crimes that would have destroyed dozens of innocent families while enabling federal prosecutions that protected frontier communities throughout the American West. His elimination had served justice more effectively than any legal procedure could have achieved given the corruption that had protected his criminal activities. The storm that had claimed Morrison and Cruz at Devil's Ridge had been memorialized as a natural disaster that demonstrated the dangers faced by investigators working to expose criminal networks, their deaths serving as inspiration for federal programs that provided better protection for law enforcement officials pursuing organized crime and dangerous frontier conditions. We honor the memory of those who have fallen in service to justice, Eleanor said, gesturing toward a memorial wall that included Morrison and Cruz among victims of criminal networks, while remaining committed to ensuring that future generations inherit institutional frameworks that can protect community welfare without requiring individual sacrifice to overcome systematic injustice. Eleanor's final act as territorial liaison involved the establishment of the Copper Falls Memorial Foundation, which provided education and support for frontier women facing circumstances similar to those that had once threatened her survival. Foundation's resources included legal assistance, economic support, and community protection networks that could prevent individual crises from requiring the desperate measures that Eleanor had been forced to employ. The Memorial Foundation has provided assistance to 127 frontier women facing threats from criminal exploitation, Eleanor announced with satisfaction that reflected her understanding of how institutional change could prevent future tragedies. These women have been able to obtain legal protection, economic independence, and community support that enables them to resist exploitation without resorting to measures that place them outside conventional legal systems. But the Foundation's most important function involved training programs that taught community organization techniques derived from Eleanor's experience, enabling other regions to develop defensive capabilities that could resist criminal exploitation through legal methods rather than the extra-legal actions that had been necessary when conventional systems failed to provide adequate protection. Community organization training has been provided to representatives from 34 frontier settlements, Eleanor reported. These programs teach methods for identifying threats, coordinating defensive measures, and working with federal authorities to ensure protection for honest residents while maintaining community autonomy and democratic participation in local governance. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows as Eleanor approached the conclusion of her address, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned that individual actions could influence the course of American democratic development when guided by principles that transcended personal interest. My appointment as director of the Federal Bureau of Community Protection represents recognition that American democratic institutions must evolve to address challenges that our founding fathers could not have anticipated, Eleanor announced to sustained applause from the assembled crowd. The frontier experience has taught us that individual conscience and institutional authority must work together to protect democratic principles while enabling communities to resist exploitation from criminal networks that view honest residents as obstacles to profitable extraction. as Eleanor prepared to depart Copper Falls for Washington, where her new federal position would influence American law enforcement policy development. She made one final journey to the high country where her transformation had begun. The meadow where Nathaniel Colton lay buried showed no trace of the violence that had changed the course of her life, restored to natural beauty that suggested peace rather than conflict. Standing beside the hidden grave, Eleanor offered no prayers for Colton's soul or regrets for actions that had been necessary to protect her honor and community from criminal exploitation. Instead, she acknowledged the weight of choices that had shaped her evolution from desperate victim into federal administrator, whose influence would protect countless American communities from similar threats. The mountain wind carried scents of pine and wildflowers that spoke of natural cycles that transcended human conflicts, suggesting continuity that connected past struggles with future possibilities for American democratic development. Eleanor's story would become part of frontier legend, but its true legacy lay in institutional changes that would protect individual conscience while strengthening community solidarity throughout the expanding American nation. I have no regrets. Eleanor spoke aloud to the mountain silence, her words carried away by wind that had witnessed countless struggles between individual conscience and institutional authority. The choices I made in defense of honor have created possibilities that will protect future generations from the kind of exploitation that once threatened our community. That legacy justifies whatever moral complexity surrounds the means that were necessary to achieve these ends. Her transformation from frightened woman confessing to murder into federal official coordinating national community protection policy demonstrated possibilities that American frontier conditions could create when extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses from ordinary people facing impossible choices between survival and principles. The honor that Eleanor had defended through necessary violence had been transformed into authority that served justice through institutional change, creating legacies that extended far beyond personal survival to encompass protection and empowerment of entire communities, committed to democratic principles that recognized both individual rights and collective responsibilities in the great American experiment of self-governance. As Eleanor mounted her horse for the final ride back to Copper Falls before departing for her new federal responsibilities, she carried with her the understanding that individual action guided by moral principle could influence the course of American democratic development when conscience demanded extraordinary measures to protect innocent people from criminal exploitation. Setting sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and beginnings, suggesting the cyclical nature of human struggle for justice that would continue long after Eleanor's story had become part of American frontier legend. Her legacy would live on in institutional frameworks that balanced individual conscience with collective responsibility, ensuring that future generations would inherit a more just society where honor defended through necessary action could be transformed into authority that served democratic principles throughout the expanding American nation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.